Good evening, everyone. As we begin this meeting, I'll ask everyone please silence their cell phones and other electronic devices and remind council that our procedure bylaw prescribes the use of technology during council meetings. It is 6:32 p.m. I'll call this meeting of Brighton Council to order. We'll begin with a territorial acknowledgement. The municipality of Brighton Council recognizes and acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Anishinaabe, now of Alderville. The Mississauga nations agreed through treaties with the Crown to mutual sharing obligations and responsibilities as stewards of the lands and waters. We recognize that these are now our shared obligations in partnership to continue to protect the land and the water that we now know as Brighton. In doing our work, we honor the Indigenous ancestors who came before us and who continue to be present in lands which we occupy. We acknowledge and honor the Indigenous people who continue to hold and share their rich history, traditions, and cultures that are proud, modern, and vibrant. I have a motion moved by Councillor Butwell, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that Council approve the June 3rd, 2024 agenda as presented. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? Being none opposed, that motion's carried. Members of Council, do you have any declarations of pecuniary interest? And if so, please state the general nature thereof. And there are none noted. Are there any announcements this evening? Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Mayor. Somewhere over the weekend, I read that this week is Recognized School Crossing Guards Week. So I would like to recognize our crossing guards who all do an awesome job protecting our most precious residents here in Brighton.
Thank you for that. I'll confirm that it is in fact School Crossing Guard Week and maybe go around and shake some hands.
Quinte West says it is, so I'm sure it's here too.
I have no comment at this time. I will confirm that it is School Crossing Guard Week. Thank you for that. Are there any other announcements? Councillor Wheeldon.
I'm off to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Conference tomorrow, a few days early. So I hope to come back next week with all sorts of great ideas that I can flood your inboxes with.
We can't wait. Are there any other? Thank you for that. And have fun and learn well. Are there any other announcements? Several of us participated in the Trinity St. Andrews Pride Walk and Worship service yesterday. Councillor Wheeldon and Councillor Wright, the Deputy Mayor, were there. I think I got everybody. Good walk, good time, nice service, and it was nice to see not just Trinity St. Andrews people out and Memorial Park, but a good mix of the community who came out to celebrate the Pride event. And there'll be another Pride event in a couple of weeks with the Pride pop-ups and the opening of the Rainbow Youth Center on January 15th. So we hope people will be able to participate in those as well. And last chance for announcements. Moving to adoption of the minutes, I have a motion moved by Councillor Butwell, seconded by Councillor Fredis, that Council adopt the May 21st, 2024 Council meeting minutes as presented. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. And a motion moved by Councillor Fredis, seconded by Councillor... No, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. We have no public meeting this evening, which moves us into delegations and presentations. We have two presentations. Both presenters have 15 minutes to provide us with their information, and we'll begin with Peter Simcisko of Watson and Associates. Mr. Simcisko.
There we go. Thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you this evening to provide an overview of the development charges background study that we're preparing for the municipality. So if you could go to the next slide, please. The purpose of today's presentation is to really walk through or provide a high-level overview of the methodology that we're required to follow under the Development Charges Act when undertaking this type of study. To provide a summary of some recent legislative changes that are going to have an impact on this process moving forward, and then also to provide a summary of the preliminary findings in terms of the calculated charges and how they compare to the charges that the municipality currently has in effect. So if we could go a couple of slides forward, please. Right to the next one, please. So to start, thank you, with the introduction of development charges. So at a high level, the purpose of development charges, which are a discretionary mechanism that's available to municipalities, is to recover the capital costs that are associated with residential and non-residential growth within a municipality. Development charges are based on the growth pays for growth principle, helping shelter existing taxpayers and ratepayers from the costs related to investments into infrastructure expansion or service expansion that needs to be made to accommodate future development within a municipality. The capital costs that municipalities recover through development charges are related to infrastructure and service expansion that's in addition to what developers would typically be required to construct directly as part of subdivision agreements. So there's a lot of local service infrastructure that goes within a subdivision, for example, local roads, pipes, and sidewalks, things like that. But development charges are used to recover the costs of broader infrastructure expansion beyond the immediate subdivision. Municipalities are empowered to impose these charges under the authority of the Development Charges Act. The municipality does have a long-standing history of collecting development charges, most recently under bylaw 089-2019. And at the time that bylaw was passed by council, development charge bylaws were allowed to have a maximum shelf life of 5 years. And so that bylaw is going to be expiring on September 3rd of this year. And prior to a municipality being able to pass a new development charge bylaw, a background study has to be undertaken, which brings us to why we're here today to talk about that process. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to just very briefly here highlight that the Development Charges Act itself has undergone several amendments since the municipality completed its last development charges study back in 2019. I won't go through them in detail here, but they have changed the types of services that municipalities can recover the costs through development charges. They have provided some statutory exemptions from the payment of these charges as well, which we'll summarize a little bit later in the presentation. And most recently, so while all of these have now come into effect, most recently we saw the introduction of Bill 185, which was ordered for third reading in Parliament as of today. It was debated. It didn't yet receive royal assent. So we're going to look at some of the changes that are proposed through Bill 185 and how that might impact this process moving forward a little bit later in the presentation. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to provide a high-level summary of the process that we have to go through when establishing a development charge, as the Development Charges Act is quite prescriptive in that process that has to be followed. So there's a lot of information in the illustration here. I'll just highlight a few of the key points. Starting at the very top, the process begins by looking at the anticipated amount of development within a municipality. And we're looking at that both in terms of the amount as well as the type and location of that development that's expected to occur. Having established that growth forecast for the municipality, we then have to look at the anticipated increase in need for service that growth is expected to generate. And we're looking at that within the different services that a municipality provides and the services that are eligible for inclusion in a development charge. And typically that begins with a fairly general understanding of where there might be some capacity constraints or issues created by growth, either in terms of additional facility space that would be needed, additional vehicles or equipments to service additional sidewalks, for example, additional roads that are assumed through the subdivision process, or looking at water and wastewater treatment capacity as well. Once we identify those increases in need for service, we're then looking at specific projects or investments that would have to be undertaken to meet that increase in need for service and the associated costs. We do have to put those against a couple of tests. Firstly, we have to measure those future needs relative to the historical level of service that's been provided in a municipality over the past 15 years. And that test is there to ensure that development charges do not become a mechanism that allows a municipality to fund an increase or improvement to the level of service that's being provided. Development charges are intended to be a mechanism to help maintain service levels even as the community grows. We also need to ensure that there is an expression of council that those increases in need for service will be met. Typically, that expression comes in the form of approved prior development charge background studies, approved master plans, approved capital forecasts, and other various similar planning documents as well. And that's to ensure that the development charges study doesn't become a wish list of capital needs, but that those needs are premised on prior planning documents to the extent possible. So once we've identified those eligible or those capital needs by service and their associated costs, we have to observe a few noteworthy deductions, which are illustrated with the yellow boxes towards the bottom of the illustration, most notably to the extent that any given project is going to benefit the existing population. We have to deduct that share of the project costs and cannot include that in the calculation of the charge. Similarly, if the municipality is expecting any grants or other external contribution towards any of these capital needs, we have to deduct those as well and cannot ask future development to pay for that. So once we've made those deductions, we end up with net development charge recoverable costs. In addition to those pure capital costs, we also have the ability to include the cost of interest to the extent the municipality expects to have to borrow money to fund any of these growth-related needs, and then we can calculate a charge. And so typically that works by taking the development charge eligible costs, apportioning them between residential and non-residential development. On the residential side, we are then dividing those costs by the anticipated amount of population growth to come up with a charge per capita, and then translating that into a charge for different types of residential units based on average occupancy levels for those units. On the non-residential side, we are taking those non-residential share of cost, dividing that by the amount of gross floor area that's expected to develop over the forecast period to come up with a charge per square foot or square meter of gross floor area in that regard. So that's the mechanics of the methodology. Those calculations and that methodology will be provided in detail in the formal development charges background study, which is going to be published next week. The following slides for the remainder of the presentation will provide a summary of the major components of the methodology and the calculations undertaken. So on the next slide, we just have a summary of the development charges that are currently in effect. Again, just wanted to highlight here that there are different charges for different types of residential units, again, varied by the average occupancy levels for those different unit types. So recognizing that an apartment unit would have a lower number of occupants than a single detached home, the corresponding charge is lower as well, recognizing that there's a lesser service demand that smaller unit places on municipal services. So if we can go 2 slides forward, then I wanted to provide here a summary of the growth forecast that has been prepared for the municipality. This forecast is developed based on the county's municipal comprehensive review that was completed in 2021 and the allocations of growth by area municipality within that report. So we have identified the growth to 2 planning horizons of over a 10-year forecast to 2034, and then also over a longer planning period to 2051. And as we can see in the second set of rows towards the bottom of the table, we see those increments, both in terms of population and employment that we're expecting over those respective periods. So for example, over the 10-year period to 2034, we are expecting the population to increase by just under 1,500 people. And we're expecting that population growth to be accommodated in about 704 additional dwelling units over that 10-year period. Similarly, on the non-residential side, we are expecting job growth of about 160 additional employees within the municipality, and that job growth would be accompanied by a growth in building space of about 140,000 square feet. And then similarly, you can see the increments for the longer period to 2051, and then also for the 10-year period within the urban serviced areas only. As we do for water and wastewater charges, we want to calculate those based on the growth expected within the serviced areas only. So if we can go to the next slide then, so having looked at the anticipated amount of growth, we're then looking at what are these services that the municipality provides that are eligible for funding through a development charge. And so the list on the slide here provides the full list of eligible services as identified in the Development Charges Act. And what we have highlighted with the teal color are the services that have been considered through this development charges study. So very much consistent with the services that the municipality has had in its development charge bylaws historically: water, wastewater, services related to a highway, so roads and related infrastructure, fire services, library, parks and recreation, and public health as well. We can go to the next slide then. In terms of the development charge eligible capital costs. So having gone through the list of services that are eligible, what are the actual costs that can be recovered through a development charge? So generally those relate to cost of acquiring land for these services, costs related to improving land, costs related to constructing buildings or more generally facilities, as well as the equipment furnishings within those facilities, as well as equipment and fleet assets that are required for service provision as well. And also capital leases related to these items as well. So the municipality doesn't need to be purchasing these items, could be leasing those items as well as long as there's a capital component to that lease. In addition to those capital costs, municipalities are also allowed to recover the costs related to expanding circulation materials within their library service as well, even though those may not be treated capital in the traditional sense of the word. There are a few noteworthy ineligible capital costs as well, most noteworthy being the acquisition of land for parks, because municipalities have authority under the Planning Act to secure land for parks or payments or cash in lieu of parkland from development, as well as any vehicles and equipment with a useful life of less than 7 years. Those cannot be included in the calculation of the charge. And then generally computer equipment is an ineligible capital cost as well. So on the next slide, we have a summary of the planning horizons that we've looked at for the various services. You will see that for most of them, we are planning for 10 years worth of growth, just based on the amount of needs that have been identified. Those really at this point in time relate to a 10-year planning horizon. With the one exception being fire protection services, where the needs that have been identified would potentially provide capacity for servicing growth beyond that 10-year window. And so when calculating the development charges and identifying those capital needs, we have looked at that longer term planning horizon to 2051. On the next slide, then, we have a summary of the capital needs that have been identified through this process. In total, across all of these service areas that we are looking at, we have identified $115 million worth of gross capital costs related to various projects. Again, those will be detailed within the background study that will be made available next week. We do have to make several deductions, as noted earlier. So we have deducted about 55% of that 115 million to recognize the benefit to existing population. That's where there's an upgrade of an existing road happening, for example, or a replacement of an existing water main with a larger water main. We need to observe that there's that benefit to the existing infrastructure population that's happening through that process. So again, about 55% of the gross capital needs have been deducted as a benefit to existing. We have also identified that there's about 16% of these capital needs that relate to or will provide capacity for growth beyond that 10-year planning horizon as well, to make sure we're not asking the growth over the next 10 years to pay for that additional capacity. We have also observed some grants and external contribution towards the capital projects, representing about 5% of the gross capital needs. And then we have also observed that there's some money sitting in development charge reserve funds that the municipality has collected from past development charges that can be applied towards these future capital needs as well. That represents about 3% of the gross capital costs. And so that leaves us with total development charge recoverable costs of about $24.3 million. And then you see how that amount breaks down by service area in a table to the right of the slide, with the greatest share of development charge recoverable cost being within the water area. The next biggest area being fire, representing about 22% of those DC recoverable costs, and then followed by wastewater, roads and related services, parks and recreation, public health, and finally library, which represents about 1% of the DC recoverable costs. So on the next slide, next couple of slides, we're going to look at what that then means in terms of a calculated charge for a couple of different types of development. In the first table here, we are looking at the calculated development charges for a single detached home. And the calculated charges are shown in the third column of the table here. And we're comparing those to the charges that are currently in effect under the municipality's development charges bylaw, as also indexed from time to time. So we are seeing that there is a relatively large increase to the calculated charge. At the top of the table, we see that comparison for services that are recovered on a municipal-wide basis. So regardless of where in a municipality the development is occurring, they pay that municipal-wide component of the charge, where we see an increase of about $4,000 per unit, which represents an increase of about 35% relative to the charges that are currently in effect, with the largest increases being within fire protection services. Those needs have been informed by the fire master plan that the municipality completed in 2023. There is certainly the need for some additional fire facility space that has been identified through that master plan, as well as some additional apparatus and equipment related to that facility expansion as well. So that's what's driving the increase in need within fire. And then the other large increases within the parks and recreation component of the charge, where there are some new or additional curling club and arena construction costs that have been added to the development charge calculation that weren't in the prior development charge study. The 2019 DC study only included the land acquisition and study costs related to that project, whereas now we are including a portion of the construction cost of that project as well. So that's the other main contributor to the increase in the charge. At the bottom of the table, we then see the charges for water and wastewater services, where again, we are seeing some large increases to both components of the charge. Within wastewater, that charge would be going up by about $6,000 per unit. And that's mainly driven by the cost increase for the wastewater treatment facility upgrades. This is a project that has been included in the municipality's bylaws and development charge studies historically. But certainly relative to the cost estimate that we had identified as part of the 2019 DC study process, where I think we had about 900 or just under $1 million of DC eligible costs, that share now has jumped to $4.5 million. So it's taking the same share of the total project cost as we have taken in the past. But as you're all aware, the cost estimates for those upgrades have grown significantly over recent years. So that's what's driving the increase on the wastewater side. And then within water services, we see an increase of about $8,000 per unit. That's mostly driven by the addition of a water main twinning project, which is again development driven, which comes at a significant cost of about $3.5 million. And then as well as a booster pump station at about $500,000 that's been included in the calculation of the charge. So that adds about, those two projects alone add about $4 million to what was previously just over $1 million in growth related needs in the prior DC study. So that's what's driving the increase on the water size. Or on the water side, rather. So then on the next slide, we have a very similar comparison, this time showing the charges that are currently in effect per square foot of gross floor area for non-residential development. And then in the third column of the table showing what the calculated charges would be. What we see here is that for the municipal-wide components of the charge, we actually see a slight decrease of about 8% in the calculated charge relative to what's currently in effect. But then when we look at water and wastewater, so the total charges payable in the urban serviced areas, we see an increase of about 64% to the charges that are currently in effect on a per square foot basis. So then on the next couple of slides, to put those calculated charges and current charges into some context relative to other area municipalities, we want to provide this comparison, which shows in this instance, the development charges payable for a single detached home in a selection of area municipalities. And what we have included for completeness are also charges that are imposed by upper tier municipalities as well, which is illustrated with the orange portion of the bars. And then the green portion of some of the bars represents education development charges where those are applicable as well. So this is meant to illustrate the total development charges payable on a single detached home in the different municipalities. The gray arrow on the far right-hand side of the illustration shows where the municipality's development charges are currently. That's about just under $17,700 per unit, including the county's development charge. And then what we are illustrating with the two teal arrows to the left, first of all, the leftmost one is showing what the full calculated development charge would be at just under $35,900 per unit. And then the middle teal arrow or middle arrow is illustrating where the charges would be if the municipality is required to phase in the development charge. So under the Act currently, and this is something that's potentially changing very soon, but currently municipalities are required to phase in their development charge bylaws over a period of 5 years, where in the first year of the bylaw, a municipality can impose a maximum of 80% of the calculated charge, and then can increase that by 5 percentage points each year until in year 5 of the bylaw, you can impose the full extent of the calculated charge. So we are showing where that charge would be if the new bylaw is passed under the legislation as it reads today. So very similar comparison then on the next slide, showing again the charges in this case payable on per square foot of commercial development in fully serviced areas. Again, with the gray arrow to the right showing the charges that are currently applicable at about $10.50 per square foot, and then showing where that charge would be at the full rate, which is the leftmost arrow, at about $16 per square foot, or with the 80% phase-in at about just over $13 per square foot. So certainly there would be an increase, but what it does also show is that those calculated development charges are still well within the range of development charges that we see in other area municipalities. And I would also note that several of the municipalities that are included here are undertaking their own development charge reviews as we speak. And typically when those reviews happen, charges do go up just because costs escalate over time. So this is a bit of a moving target, but as we understand the numbers today, this is an accurate comparison.
Peter, if I may, I assume council does not want me to cut the presenter off. He's had his 15 minutes, but we're going to let him go. Carry on.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So in the next section of the presentation, we want to cover some of the policy matters. If we could go to the next slide, please. I did want to touch on the fact that there are some exemptions and discounts and other provisions that are both mandated by the province. So each municipality has to observe these in their development charge bylaws, and those are listed on the left-hand side of the table here. So just to go through the statutory exemptions that each municipality has to observe. So firstly, industrial expansion or expansion of industrial buildings up to 50% of the existing gross floor area would be exempt from the payment of development charges. Additions to residential buildings are generally exempt from development charges. The development by a municipality or an upper tier municipality or school boards are generally exempt. Additional residential units are exempt as well. Up to 2 additional units can be added to a single detached home, for example, either directly within the home or in a structure ancillary to that home without triggering development charges. Affordable residential units are fully exempt from the development charge. And I'll speak to that in a little bit more detail. This is a very new exemption that just came into effect on June 1st, in fact. So as of today. And so I'll unpack that a little bit shortly. Attainable residential units is something that's going to be exempt in the future as well, once we receive regulations from the province defining what attainable units will mean. We haven't seen that quite yet. Not-for-profit housing development is fully exempt from development charges, as well as universities that receive funding from the province. So in addition to these exemptions, there are also other provisions within the Development Charges Act that reduce the amount that certain developments have to pay. So as mentioned earlier, municipalities are required to phase in their development charges over a period of 5 years. So that reduces the amount payable over the initial years of the bylaw. Rental housing developments receive discounts depending on the number of bedrooms within each unit. Those discounts ranging from 15 to 25% off the full development charge. Developments that proceed through a site plan or a zoning bylaw amendment process, they have their development charges frozen, if you will, in time at the rates that were in effect when that planning application was submitted to the municipality. So even though they might not be coming forward for a building permit until, let's say, 1.5 years later, the development charges payable are based on the rates that were in effect when that planning application was submitted to the municipality. There is, however, a 2-year time limit on how much time they have to, from the time of approval of the application to the time of building permit issuance, to qualify for that development charge freeze. And then finally, for rental housing developments and institutional developments, they don't pay their development charges in one step at the time of building permit issuance, but rather over 6 equal annual installments. That's again mandated under the Act. So in addition to those statutory exemptions and discounts and reductions, municipalities also have the discretion to impose additional exemptions from the payment of development charges. Historically, the municipality has had an exemption in there for places of worship, as well as churchyards, cemeteries, those types of developments. They do not pay development charges, a very common exemption in municipal development charge bylaws. And also industrial development has historically and currently is fully exempt in the municipality from the payment of development charges. Again, a very common exemption across the province. So those are the key exemption policies from the bylaw. And then I want to, if we could go 2 slides forward, touch on Bill 185 in a little bit more detail, or what's known as the Cutting Red Tape to Building More Homes Act. This was introduced back in April. As I mentioned earlier, it's gone through 2 readings in Parliament. It was then ordered to a standing committee for further discussion. It's now been ordered for 3rd reading without any significant amendments, at least as it pertains to the Development Charges Act. And basically what Bill 185 is doing is walking back a number of the changes that were introduced by the province through Bill 23. So first of all, they're proposing to remove that mandatory phase-in that I talked about earlier from development charge bylaws. They are also proposing to reinstate growth-related studies as a development charge eligible cost, which is currently ineligible through the changes through Bill 23. Then a couple of more technical amendments that they're proposing to make is to shorten the time limit on the development charge freeze from 2 years down to 18 months. And then they are also modernizing public notice requirements. That doesn't just pertain to the Development Charges Act, but also to Planning Act, and I think some others as well. Where if a municipality doesn't have a local print paper, they are allowing municipalities to post notices of public meetings, for example, on the municipal website. So more of a technical amendment in that regard. So if Bill 185 comes into force before council considers approval of the new development charge bylaws, there are a number of amendments that we'll be making to the background study that's going to be released next week. Currently, we're thinking that the direction is going to be for the municipality to impose development charges under a separate bylaw for each service. If Bill 185 passes, we're going to consolidate those bylaws into one bylaw again. So again, I just wanted to make you aware of this, as you might see some changes from when we release the background study next week, and before the public meeting, or even potentially after the public meeting, as we respond to Bill 185 coming into force. So that's one of the changes we might be making. If again, Bill 185 comes into force, making growth-related studies an eligible cost again, we would be identifying any growth-related studies that the municipality is planning to undertake over the next 10 years, and including those in the calculation of the charge as well. So these are things like master plans, cost of the development charges study itself, and other similar costs as well. So we are working with staff to identify those growth-related needs or studies at this point, just so that we have them ready to go, again, if Bill 185 comes into force. And then we would also be removing from the draft bylaws or proposed bylaws references to the statutory phase-in of development charges if that's no longer required. And then just adding some wording to reflect that shortening of the DC freeze time window down to 18 months. So the final piece here is about affordable residential units. So this is something that was recently introduced and is just become effective on June 1st of this year. Are full exemptions from the payment of development charges for affordable units, affordable residential units, and that both applicable to ownership units as well as rental units. And the way that a unit qualifies for this exemption is for a rental unit if the rent that they're going to be charging is the lesser of either the income-based affordable rent or the average market rent, then that unit would qualify for an exemption from development charges. And the way they define that income-based affordable rent is they look at the distribution of incomes for all households within a municipality. They look at the household that's at the 60th percentile of that income distribution, and look at what is the rent that will represent 30% or maximum of 30% of the monthly income for that household that's at the 60th percentile. So that's how they determine that income-based affordable rent. We'll look at the specifics of what that means in the context of the municipality very shortly. And then similarly for affordable ownership units, to qualify for that affordable housing exemption, the unit has to be sold for the lesser of 90% of the market purchase price for that type of unit in the municipality, or the income-based affordable purchase price, which is determined similarly to that income-based affordable rent, where they're looking at, again, the household at the 60th percentile of the income distribution, and looking at, by the time they account for mortgage insurance and property taxes and things like that, what would be the monthly accommodation cost that would represent 30% of that income. And that's the affordable income purchase price. And we have that illustrated in a little bit more detail on the next slide. This isn't specific to the municipality, but I think looking at the numbers quickly, this does reflect the income distribution fairly closely for the municipality of Brighton as well. So for illustrative purposes, looking at that income distribution in this municipality, we see that the household at the 60th percentile of the income distribution would have a gross annual income of about $100,000. And so then they look at, if we assume there's a 5% down payment that household is putting on a house, assume a 25-year amortization on the mortgage, use the interest rate applicable to a 5-year fixed mortgage, assume about a 1.25% annually in the relative to the purchase price of the home for property taxes and things like that, and a 4% monthly mortgage insurance premium, then that translates to an affordable purchase price of about $341,000, because for that purchase price, that's the monthly accommodation cost that would represent 30% of the $100,000 annual income. And so looking at what that means in the context of the municipality specifically, so the province has released a bulletin that informs what those monthly average market rents are, what the average purchase prices for different types of units are, as well as the income-based affordable purchase prices and rents based on the test that we just went through in some detail. And so for rental units, what we have illustrated here is in the municipality of Brighton, both what the average market rents are for different types of units, ranging from bachelor to 3 and more, or 3+ bedroom units, and then comparing that to the income-based affordable rent, which is illustrated with the right bar to the right of each pair. And so based on the numbers from that provincial bulletin, it is going to be the average market rent that sets the threshold for affordable rental units. And so in order for a rental unit to qualify for the exemption from development charges, for example, for a bachelor apartment, it would need to be renting at below $1,044 per month to qualify for that exemption. Or similarly, for a 1-bedroom unit, it would need to be renting for less than $1,450 per month to qualify for that exemption. And then on the next slide, we have a similar comparison, this time for purchase units or ownership units. And so what we see here is that based on the data from that provincial bulletin, it is the income-based affordable price that will set the threshold for what's to be considered an affordable ownership unit to qualify for the exemption from development charges. And what we see is that a unit would need to be selling for less than $341,000 to qualify for that affordable unit exemption. I just wanted to put those into some context. I think what you see in the charts is that especially for the ownership units, certainly the income-based affordable price is so much lower than the market price that it's unlikely to mean a whole lot. There are unlikely to be many units qualifying for these exemptions, but just wanted to make you aware of what the numbers look like based on data for Brighton specifically. So in the final part of the presentation, just wanted to touch on another or an alternative potentially to the development charge, as I know there's been some interest expressed on this topic, and those would be capital charges under the Municipal Act, or sometimes referred to as impost fees. So municipalities, this is a potential alternative to development charges. Section 391 of the Municipal Act gives municipalities the power to fairly broad powers to impose fees and charges for services provided either directly by the municipality or on its behalf. And through that cost recovery, they can include the cost of capital for the use of capital in the calculation of the charge. The charges under the Municipal Act, again, sometimes referred to as impost fees, can be imposed whether there is an immediate or a future benefit. So a property doesn't need to immediately benefit from the capital expenditures to be charged the capital charge under the Municipal Act. But what's important is that they cannot be used to recover costs that are included in a development charge bylaw. So we cannot double count or double dip for the same capital costs. There are no public process requirements under the Municipal Act. There are also no statutory exemptions or phase-in requirements, unlike the Development Charges Act, that municipalities have to observe. So it's a little bit easier, if you will, administratively to impose, and potentially gives municipalities the ability to recover a greater share of the growth-related costs because they don't have to observe the statutory phase-ins and exemptions and things like that. So on the next slide then, I did want to provide a bit of a side-by-side comparison. I'll go through these points in a bit of detail, comparing and contrasting the capital charge under the Municipal Act, or again, the impost fee versus the development charge. To start with, in terms of the impact on the charge itself. So while there is no prescribed process that or methodology that municipalities have to follow under the Municipal Act when establishing an impost fee, generally that process looks very similar to what municipalities follow under the Development Charges Act. It's identifying the capital cost, the capital investments that would need to be made, looking at the extent of growth or development that would benefit from those investments, and then calculating a charge per capita or per unit per square foot of non-residential gross floor area. So typically we would expect the quantum of the charge to be the same, whether it's calculated under the Development Charges Act or under the Municipal Act. So the next point is talking about the impact on the level of overall cost recovery. So as mentioned a short while ago, the Development Charges Act does contain a number of statutory exemptions, which limit the extent of or the amount of growth-related capital costs that municipalities can ultimately collect through the development charge, because those exemptions and phase-ins and discounts have to be observed. So because there are no statutory exemptions under the Municipal Act, it potentially increases the overall level of cost recovery that municipalities can secure through an impost fee. In terms of the third bullet, so applicability to development and redevelopment. So development charges are really a mechanism that only recovers the growth-related costs or costs related to new development occurring within a municipality. So there has to be a building permit typically to trigger a development charge, whereas an impost fee or a connection charge, or again, capital charge under the Municipal Act can be imposed without a building permit. So this is where sometimes if a municipality has properties that are currently outside of the serviced area and it's extending a water main, for example, through the area that would allow currently unserviced properties to connect, that's a very good example of where a capital charge under the Municipal Act would be used to charge those benefiting properties for a portion of that infrastructure. Because under the development charge bylaw, there would be no trigger for that payment. There would be no building permit. So that's a very common case where municipalities do rely on the impost fees. In terms of the fourth bullet, we have the ease of implementation and future adjustments to the charge. So because there are no public process requirements prescribed under the Municipal Act, it is a little bit more straightforward to get a impost fee bylaw passed, potentially, because there's no statutory public meeting, there's no formal background study that's required. So it's a little bit easier in that regard. And also, if there were to be any future adjustments to the charge, it's a little bit easier to get an amending bylaw passed, potentially. So it's a little bit easier in that regard. Post-implementation, the Development Charges Act has a number of reporting requirements that municipalities have to adhere to. For example, the annual treasurer's statement, which has to summarize the status of the various development charge reserve funds, how much money has been collected, how that money has been applied to capital projects, how much money or what balance is in those development charge reserve funds, are just examples of the reporting that needs to be done on an annual basis. There are no such requirements under the Municipal Act. So again, administratively, it would appear to be somewhat easier in that regard under the Municipal Act. So next we get to legal challenges. So under the Development Charges Act, a development charge bylaw can be appealed for a period of 40 days. And if there is an appeal, and let's say that appeal is successful, someone successfully argues that a component of the charge was inappropriately calculated and therefore the charge should be reduced, then The Ontario Land Tribunal has the authority to require that bylaw to be amended, that charge to be reduced, and the municipality would then need to issue refunds on the money that has been collected, reflecting that reduction in the development charge. So as a result of an appeal, the risk of any refunds is really limited to the scope of the appeal, which would typically only look at a specific component of the calculation. In terms of bylaws passed under the Municipal Act, those cannot be appealed on the grounds that the charge is unreasonable, but someone can question the legality of the impost fee bylaw in its entirety. And so if a court was to find that that bylaw is needs to be quashed for whatever reason, then it would potentially result in a refund of all monies collected under that bylaw. And it's also bylaws passed under the authority of the Municipal Act are open for that legal challenge for up to a year after passage. So it's a longer time frame, and potentially the scope of the implications is broader because the refunds that would have to be issued would be larger than under a development charge appeal. The final piece there is the ability to withhold the issuance of a building permit. So the Development Charges Act gives municipalities the ability to withhold the issuance of a building permit until the development charge has been paid in full. There's no such provision explicitly, at least under the Municipal Act. So it's a question of what would happen if someone didn't pay that charge? Does the municipality have the ability to require that as a part of the development agreement? That's something that I think would certainly require further legal review, but there's no kind of direct protection built into that act in that regard. As you might be aware, the city of Kingston has historically, up to I think 2019, recovered the cost of their water and wastewater services through an impost fee. In 2019, they did switch to the development charges regime for their water and wastewater services as well. They did undergo a legal challenge to that impost fee bylaw that did find that they were operating within their authority to impose the impost fee. I would like to note, though, that there was one key difference with that legal challenge in that it was dealing specifically with costs that have always historically been only recovered through an impost fee bylaw. It was not looking at whether a municipality has the ability to switch or take costs that were previously included in a development charge bylaw and put them under the authority of an impost fee bylaw. So it didn't quite deal with that potential change from one regime to the other. Again, it did make it clear that municipalities can use either of those mechanisms, but it did not explicitly deal with making the switch from one to the other. And so that's just something I wanted to highlight. Again, these are typically, in terms of these capital charges or impost fees, they are used in municipalities that have used them historically. They could potentially be used to recover the capital costs that have not historically been included in the municipality's development charge bylaw. But I also wanted to highlight the fact that the amount of the charge would be expected to be the same as we would calculate under the development charge mechanism. So there doesn't maybe appear to be an immediate benefit to moving or considering moving to that alternative mechanism. But something we can certainly discuss further if needed. And so then on the final slide, I just wanted to highlight the next steps in this process. We are presenting the draft findings today. As mentioned earlier, we are going to be publishing the formal development charges background study on June 12th, as required under the Act. That has to happen at least 60 days prior to council considering approval of a new development charge bylaw. We are then planning to hold a statutory public meeting on July 15th, and then council would be in a position on August 12th to consider approval of the development charge background study and the associated bylaws. And then also wanted to highlight, as illustrated on the left-hand side of the slide, again, if Bill 185 comes into force prior to the new bylaws being brought forward, there might be some further amendments we need to make to that from what you'll see next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simcisko. Appreciate your presentation and the information you provided. I will open the floor to members of council for questions of clarification. Councilor Fredis.
Through the chair, thank you. Mr. Simcisko, Great presentation. Appreciate it. I'm delighted to see that imposter capital is incorporated in this study. Couple of questions come to mind. I note that water fees are higher than wastewater. And after a fairly extensive discussion this morning, it would appear that our capital needs and demands are considerably higher on the wastewater side than the water side. Also, in looking at Kingston, who's the imposed model that I've been using, I note that their wastewater charges are higher than water. So I know that you're still concluding the DC background study. Perhaps you could kind of have a closer look at those numbers in light of this morning's discussion in terms of the capital requirements over the foreseeable future for upgrading that. So that was kind of the first part. The second item is, should we be calling them impost fees or capital charges or development charges? What Kingston appears to have done is they started out calling them impost fees, but published them on their development charges list. I think Director Whitfield and I kind of came up with the same information when we were tracking down why that terminology disappeared. And it appears that kind of changes in council and management perhaps gave them a little bit of cold feet. So they dropped the term. That's kind of my understanding. But in light of the less challenges to it under the current legislation, I wonder if we're better off when we start off by calling it impost fees and making that distinction, because then because you also talk about legal challenges, and there is the Ontario Court of Appeal ruling of November 22, and it's the highest court in Ontario, so the legal precedent is there to push back against any legal challenges. So perhaps you could look at that when you're doing your study. And those are kind of my questions or requests. Thank you.
Mr. Simcisko.
Thank you. So just to go back to, I think, the point about the city of Kingston making the switch. So that's, yes, they did impose their water wastewater charges as an impost fee. They did include it in the same schedule of charges as their development charges, because those were the total charges payable on new development. They followed the same process. Oh, thank you very much. They did follow the same process in calculating both the impost fee and the development charge. I was involved in that process historically. So it was exactly the same process, except ultimately the water wastewater components were imposed under a separate bylaw under the authority of the Municipal Act, what was the impost fee, whereas the charges for all other services were imposed under the authority of the development charge. The development community was not particularly happy with that approach because of the lack of appeal, and they felt that that was unfair to do it under a mechanism that they don't have the same appeal rights for. And so through some of those discussions with the development community, the city did agree to bring everything under the development charges umbrella in 2019. And so everything is imposed as a development charge from that point forward. In terms of the legal challenge, so yes, that case that you cited did make it clear that municipalities have the ability to impose charges under either mechanism. But again, that legal challenge only dealt with the specific case of Kingston, who had these water and wastewater capital costs historically always under the authority of the Municipal Act. So that legal challenge didn't deal with the case of a municipality making the switch from something that used to be in a development charge and putting it under a Municipal Act bylaw. So that could still potentially be challenged. And I'm certainly not a legal expert. I think that's something that legal counsel would need to weigh in on to see if they perceive there to be any risk associated with that.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from members of council? I have a motion moved by Councillor Fredis, seconded by Councillor Butwell. The council receive the presentation from Peter Simcisko, Manager Partner Watson and Associates regarding development charges information session. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor? Being none opposed, that motion's carried. Thanks again, Peter. Appreciate the information. Look forward to next steps next. Next presentation is from Northumberland County, CAO Jennifer Moore and Treasurer Matthew Nitsch. Welcome to Brighton. It's worth the drive, as you know.
Good evening, and how lucky are you? Development charges and county budget all in one night. Like, wow. Thank you for having us here again this year. As many of you are aware, we come visit annually and talk a little bit about what is happening at the county and what our big projects and initiatives are, what we did last year, and then Matt will tell us a little bit about what is happening with the county budget. So we'll go to the first slide. There we go. As I mentioned, we have a lot going on, and last year was certainly a very busy year as well. A lot of opportunities, a lot of challenges. We did meet many of our goals, but as you know, the world is changing rapidly, and the challenges that we face as a local government have really added a lot of complexity to the work that we do, and we've had to adjust in how we deliver our services so that we can best serve our residents and also balance that with maintaining affordability and where we can improve some of our efficiencies. Over the past year, we showed some of that adaptability, and we took on we'll give some highlights of some of the big projects that we worked on. We've increased our investments in IT solutions and expanded shared services agreements to municipalities to combat the rising cybersecurity threats. We've introduced new online road permit portal to streamline the processes and improve our service delivery there. We've secured some crucial funding and leveraged partnerships to address our aging infrastructure and support some capital improvement. A couple of projects to highlight are the Golden Plough Lodge redevelopment and the Elgin Park redevelopment, which is an affordable housing and social housing project. With the decline of our media in the region, we've also had to expand our online outreach and engagement and how we're increasing our presence and our availability to the community. We've enhanced both our signage and our papers-based communications, and this is really helping in our commitment to being open and transparent in what we do and trying to rebuild some of the trust that we do see across the general public. Recent economic impacts have hit lower levels of government hard. And we know that only less than 10% of every tax dollar comes to municipalities, and we've got a lot of services to deliver, and many of those continue to expand. So this year, we actually did a bit of a change in course, and we did our first ever 3-year budget so that we can improve predictability and stability. We've also supported the startup of over 70 small businesses in 2023, and that was are achieving a lot of new growth, expanding the Port Hope urban area and the county official plan, which will allow for some new homes. So a lot is going on across the county in 2023, and we'll expand on some of those highlights over the next few slides. So as we move to the next slide, this slide summarizes the work that we did last year with our strategic plan. And of course, this is where it all starts. We do a new strat plan with every term of council, and we look out for 4 years. The real overriding theme of this one was guiding growth with intention. We know that we are set to grow to 122,000 residents by 2051. That's a bit of a change from where we're at today, but we do know that as that growth happens, we need to plan and be prepared for that growth coming to the east, typically. When we went through the strat planning exercise, there was input from over 900 residents, businesses, First Nations, community partners, staff, and elected officials. It was the biggest outreach that we've seen for one of our strategic plans. When we look at what went into the strategic plan and some of the critical areas of focus, there's workforce development, housing, transportation, health, broadband connectivity to ensure that we're shaping up an inclusive, prosperous, and thriving community, as we know that we are going to see a lot of transformative change. On the next slide, it summarizes the 5 pillars. 4 of them should look pretty familiar. They are the evolution of what we've had in our previous strategic plans with the Innovate for Service Excellence, Ignite Economic Opportunity, Propel Sustainable Growth, and Foster a Thriving Community. The 5th pillar is something new for us. It's to champion a vibrant future. And you'll see there's some comments later on in the presentation where this is really about how we advocate and work with other levels of government and pivotal organizations. The next slide talks just a little bit about our performance dashboard. While we are here to tell you a little bit about what happened last year and what's coming up, we also have a self-serve option now with our dashboard being launched earlier this year. It tracks over 30 indicators across various topics, particularly around performance measures. It looks at everything from childcare and licensed spaces, paramedic response times, our financials, waste performance, and so on. They are a number of indicators about all of our different services. And there's also some indicators that are really just about community health in general for those that are interested in some interesting facts and figures and shaping of what's happening around the county. Others are actually denoting how successful we are at meeting and achieving our objectives. It is online, it's active. We are already seeing that over 775 visits have occurred in the first 3 months that it was live online. We will continue to add more metrics and modify the metrics are there. There's an opportunity for public feedback to tell us if they're looking for something different than what we have up there. And we've already added some things. For example, most recently, we've added the availability of shelter beds because that was a demand from the public and an area of interest. So we'll continue to expand this, but we encourage everybody to go take a look and see. We have measures that some are updated monthly, quarterly, and some are only annually, depending on the metric. Moving to the next slide, this one will just actually, we'll move past to the next one after this. So the first pillar is Innovative for Service Excellence. And you can see this is really about how we do the best at what we are doing, looking at using technology, looking at our training and our staff, and how we can be the most impactful in how we deliver our services. When we move to the next slide, we've got some examples of what we're doing and what we did last year. Of course, GIS, here we've moved to more service agreements and expanded. We now have 5 member municipal partners in offering those services. We did the same thing with IT. We now have 4 member municipalities and 1 local police service, all in managed service agreements, and continuing to talk with the other municipalities that are not yet participating in those agreements as we look to expand and find efficiencies and enhance services for everyone. Also part of this service in 2023, we responded to a cybersecurity incident. This was a very big initiative for us. Unfortunately, it was with our Port Hope Police Service, and it required a lot of work, but the learning from that was a great opportunity for our staff and what they've been able to put in place for the county in response to the risk of future incidents, as well as what we're able to do to try and mitigate for all of our partners. So it was a great making the best of a bad situation, a fabulous learning opportunity. When we look at an intelligent workplace, we're investing in the next generation of cybersecurity tools to bolster our resistance against future threats. We've introduced a joint data collection and case management system for our local service providers for homelessness to use the technology that is there. This is a federal government technology to help improve our coordinated response. So using technology where we can. And this is a really great software tool to help us shape what the need is as we address homelessness across the county. We're also leading edge when it comes to technology in our POA courts. We were one of the first out of the gate with a fully hybrid court, and we're proud to say that others are following our lead now. A lot of efficiencies there when we think about things like bringing in translators, when we think about how residents or those that are challenging fines, they're able to come to court virtually and save a lot of time and for everyone that's involved. We're also moving to a lot more in online and virtual meetings as everybody is. This year, we'll release our first ever communications master plan. It was launched last year. There was a lot of community consultation, and we will see how we want to communicate with the public and what their expectations and demands are over the next decade. Developing and retaining talent continues to be a top priority for us when we think about service excellence. We launched our people plan late in 2022, and we will continue to implement that as we started looking at recruitment and retention. And we've already seen some great examples of succession planning and how we can retain and advance the careers of some of our really excellent employees that we have. When we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about igniting economic opportunity. This is where we really speak to striving for excellence in how we can attract and expand the focus on economic development, looking at connectivity. Things that are in here are transportation capacity to keep us on the move, attracting the talent, not just for the county as a corporation, but talent across all of our sectors in the county. Things like early childhood educators, manufacturing, agriculture, all of our key industries, and how can we just stimulate business in general. When we go to the next slide, again, we have some examples of activities under this pillar and some great photos there of what we were up to. We sold out the She Owns It entrepreneurship conference that had over 120 women that came to that conference and talked about strategies to grow and see their businesses succeed. We also did a lot of work through the Business Entrepreneurship Center, helped launch over 76 businesses and create 130 jobs. Of course, we've talked about the OAFBC just next door in Culvert, where we have helped launch over 450 food entrepreneurs and farmers to bring their products and services to market. The broadband initiative, you've heard us talk about this one before. It has been a rather complex undertaking, and of course, the rapidly changing economy and inflation did not help the challenges of that project. We are hoping that we will soon conclude negotiations with our private sector partners, and we'll be able to get shovels in the ground this year. We also have a thriving manufacturing sector, and we've heard a lot about growth in the previous presentation. We saw last year non-residential construction values reach 66 million, with our industrial sectors setting a record of 17.9 million construction values. So a lot of activity happened, and really being out there on the cutting edge. When we look at, we saw a lot of activity and advocacy around commuting, and we also continue to see a lot of partnerships with our member municipalities. Moving to thriving and fostering a thriving and a community. This is where we get into a lot of our social programming. Here, again, when we flip to the next slide, we'll see a lot around housing and homelessness and work that we are doing there. We can see that unfortunately homelessness is on the rise. And on this slide, you'll see some of the activities that we have. Oh, if we just flip to the next one. Oh, there we go, Candace. Thank you. Elgin Park redevelopment, of course, is on track as we look at advancing more housing units. We've opened 20 units last year in phase 1 and phase 2. We'll see another 20 units later on this year. We have offered 139 permanent rent subs, and we've transitioned 7 chronically homeless individuals into long-term housing. 310 Division Street is another project for modernizing our shelter services. It is a building that we purchased in Cobourg, and it will help us make our shelter services more suitable. We also purchased a 22-unit apartment complex in Colborne at 123 King Street, and really the focus there is about keeping people housed in affordable units and not losing any units. We're also in the process of designing 473 Ontario Street in Cobourg, which will be a 62-unit building. We continue to be challenged by vacancy rates across the county, as many of our residents do pay more than 30% of their income on housing. So looking at continuing to expand the efforts for preserving and new housing. And our long-term strategy is 251 new units of affordable housing over the next 3 years. We've also moved 59 households off the consolidated wait list into rent geared to income. However, unfortunately, we do have over 1,000 people on that wait list. So while we're making progress, it is a very daunting task to see folks get the services that they need. We have a cross-section of programs, and we can, happy to take questions and go into those in a little more detail. but we are also looking at other services to support those that are in need. Things like the commitment of 401 new childcare spaces, and we are on track to do that by 2026. We're collaborating with partners like the Ontario Health Team on a number of healthcare initiatives, and we'll see the launch in a few weeks of the new Port Hope walk-in clinic for primary healthcare needs for our unrostered residents. And as well, we responded to over 25,000 911 calls with our community paramedics. And of course, we can't forget the cutest individual in the picture. And even the warden has had a few photo opportunities with Ivy, our new support pup in training, and she is a big hit. As we move to the next slide, propel sustainable growth. This one is really about the meat and potatoes of looking at how we maintain our infrastructure, and we'll go to the next slide. And we'll see that this is talking about our roads. Of course, we have over 500 kilometers that we're maintaining and continuing to keep it up. We're continuing to design the Trent River crossing here in Brighton. We know that County Road 64 is slated for reconstruction, a project that's on everybody's mind. We're currently finalizing the tenders, and it's anticipated that July through August of this year, we'll be working on the rural portion of that project with the more urban portion in 2025. On the safety front, of course, there's a number of projects across the county that look at upgrading the safety at various intersections and installing safety devices. This year, we'll work on Braithwaite Bridge. We did that last year, and Thompson Bridge. This year is Campbellford Bridge, as well as a number of culverts. Commuter Connect is a project for looking at transit, and it was I guess it was a pilot to see how that would work and what that uptake would be. Continue to work on the long-term care facility. We are over 70% complete for that construction. We also saw the sale of the recycling plant this year. We're no longer in that business. That is now being operated by Circular Materials, but no change to the residents for the next couple of years. That program will maintain its current status until at least 2026. We've also continued to work on our landfill. I know that's always near and dear to the hearts of the folks here as we look at more opportunities to divert materials out of the landfill and launch new programs to increase that diversion. And we did see a very detailed presentation today at County Council that everyone might be interested in looking at how we're continuing to expand those services with upcoming mattress diversion this year to look at more capacity. We'll do the next slide around championing a vibrant future, and I'm going to go right past that one to the next slide. And this is really, as I said, our new pillar where we talk about intensifying government relations and working to enhance a more coordinated response when we look at communicating out to the public and what the calls are for upper levels of government to partner with us. So things like housing and homelessness, we can't solve it on our own. We need everyone there, and making sure that we're sharing that message with other levels of government. We know that we need transit. We know that we need things like primary care and making sure that the work that the county is doing is seeing our other partners come to the table. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt to talk a little bit about the budget side.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I just have a couple of slides to finish up. I'm going to look just at a very high level overview of the county's 2024 budget and long-term plan. And as Jennifer mentioned, this was our first multi-year budget, so it covers the years 24 to 26. Some more detailed info can be found in the infographic that I handed out at the beginning. And I apologize, we'll get you an electronic version of that. And it's also on our website with a more detailed budget information. So the county budget, this slide shows that the 2024 budget is a total of $219 million. It can be broken down into its components: $142 million for operating, $67 million for capital, and a net transfer to reserves of $10 million. The 2024 budget continues to be higher than what I would say is our typical budget. This is because of extraordinary non-recurring large capital projects that we currently have underway. The main one being the rebuild of our long-term care home, the Golden Plough Lodge, but also some housing projects, the Elgin Street project that Jennifer mentioned, and another one underway on Ontario Street in Coburg. The financing from the levy for the budget is 74 million, and this represents an increase of 6.57% after growth. So we break this down a little bit further. It's a 4.57% base levy increase. And then we also have a 1% increase for our dedicated infrastructure levy, which we've had for a number of years now, which was put in place to help combat our infrastructure deficit. And we also have a 1% increase for a new dedicated social housing levy, which is council adopted this year to help combat the housing and homelessness problem. And the last slide here, this is just a look at the 2024 budget, how the both operating and capital combined, how they're allocated by our departments. The largest here at 27% is our major capital projects department. So this department oversees projects in their construction phases. And again, the main projects that they're working on are the Golden Plough Lodge rebuild, our 2 social housing projects, and we're starting to ramp up work on the Trent River Campbellford Bridge crossing. The next largest piece of the pie is 17% for community and social services. So this is these are just some of the main items that fall underneath, but housing and homelessness are all of our early years programs, the new Canada-wide early learning childcare program, which is your $10 a day childcare that you've heard about in the news. Ontario Works. The transportation is the next biggest at 14%. So this is maintenance of our 500 kilometers of roads, our 100 significant bridges and structures, as well as the surface treatment program that we undertake for ourselves and our member municipalities. Then the next largest is the Golden Plough Lodge, long-term care home at 11%, paramedics at 9%, waste management at 7%, and then some of the smaller departments that make up the difference. We would normally bring copies of our strategic plan, but we unfortunately ran out of copies. So it is available electronically on our website if you're interested. And that is all I have. We're happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you both. Members of council, any questions or comments? Councillor Paredes.
Just a question of clarification, if we could go back to the last slide. Is that possible? No? Okay.
Just give Robin 10 seconds. She can manage it. Which slide?
The last one with the pie chart on it.
There you go.
There we are. That's it. Thank you. Perhaps it's a typo or I don't quite understand, but it shows the budget allocation. It says major capital projects 27% and it says GPL. And then it says Golden Plough Lodge at 11%. Are they not one and the same thing?
One's operational and one's the rebuild.
Okay.
So until the project is turned over to the department, it falls under a separate department called Major Capital Projects.
Any other questions or comments? Councillor Wheeldon.
Thank you. There is a note among the capital projects of a joint operations facility for 65 million. What facility is that?
CA Hill.
There's currently a study underway to look at consolidating our public works operations. Currently, we have two major sites where we have staff deployed out of, as well as our rolling stock and various pieces of equipment. Plus, we have multiple sand domes, that sort of thing. We also have, when we look at our facilities, they don't have a current home base. They kind of have their stuff scattered all across the various county buildings. And with the loss of the MRF, that's kind of shaken up where our waste staff sit. Plus some of our other buildings are at capacity. So, and there's also some of our services like the Bewdley Community Recycling Center, because that's where we're seeing the most growth on the west end of the county. And when we look at all of our diversion programs, we of course need a big bin for each one of those things. That site is reaching capacity between the number of customers and the actual space it takes to do that type of diversion. So there's a number of things on the public works side as well. When we look at the future needs for ambulance response times, we need to get a base more centrally located. So this would be looking at moving those types of operations into a more central location within the county and putting them on one site. So this is a look into the future and looking at efficiencies and how we can streamline those operations by getting them co-located and then probably rationalizing some of the properties that we currently operate from.
Councillor Freitas.
Thank you. Through the chair to CEO Moore, I was encouraged to hear you talk about broadband. And I gather you're still negotiating, I think you said, but you're hoping to have shovels in the ground this year. Can we still anticipate that the shovels will start in Brighton and move their way west?
That continues to be the plan because that's where it gets hooked up.
Councillor Rowley.
Thank you. The childcare initiative that you spoke about, Jennifer, you're looking to add 400 plus new spaces for childcare. Will that include spaces here in Brighton as well?
The current spaces that are under construction are 2 locations in Port Hope and 1 in Warkworth. And then there's a bit of a question mark. We did just open some new spaces in Brighton. That was just late last year. So when we look at the overall need, there is a more urgent need in Port Hope and Warkworth at this point, but there will be, should be more spaces announced. It is challenging at this point because with the CWELC funding, we're starting to kind of bump up against what they've announced for capital improvements, and most of our daycares are at capacity. So for pretty much any new spaces, we need new construction. So it has to be renovating buildings or purchasing buildings, whatever it might be. We can't put more kids in the spaces that we're currently operating as kind of. So right now there is those couple of projects in Port Hope and Warkworth, and we'll see. They're continuing to look at what the need is across the county, but nothing is earmarked specifically for Brighton at this point. But it's all kind of in the works.
Thank you. Anything further? Councillor Wheeldon.
Thank you. You mentioned workforce housing. The Housing and Homelessness Task Force got a nice overview of it from Mr. Borowick 2 weeks ago. Is that launching soon, and how much of the budget is going towards that?
Well, it should be launching really soon because we have now hired the first employee to do that work, and he started today. So we will see that move forward. From a budget perspective, the first item is acquiring land, and we're looking to do that as cost effectively or close to zero as possible. But there is, I think we said it was, I think $500,000 is what we agreed that the county would actually loan the Workforce Housing Corporation to get it started. The intent is that ultimately it will maintain itself. It needs startup money, but it is designed to be a cost recovery over time.
Thank you. Anyone else? Can you talk to us about the timeline to open the homeless shelter in Culvert?
The timeline is currently for very early fall. We were hoping for a little sooner, but we've had a few bumps in the road, but we are working through those. The designs came in last week, so we should be ready to start construction as soon as we can get building permits in the next couple of weeks. The renovations are not massive. We just need to tweak it a little bit. Some rooms are as simple as painting. Really where the most work has to occur is in the drop-in center, which would be the first floor, with the upper floor, a couple upper floors being the sleeping quarters for the emergency shelter, and the top floor will be converted into transitional housing apartments. So a little bit longer stay than what it would be in the shelter. So there'll be 3 distinct components, and that construction should start with a phased opening, hopefully late August, early September.
Thank you. You and I have spoken quite a lot about housing opportunities for actual, affordable housing for government affordable housing. Brighton has two locations, as you know. Can you talk to us about what it would take for that kind of partnership to happen again in this community?
Okay. So we are getting a little bit creative for our community housing. That's today's term, is community housing now. And our projects are a little bit different in that historically they were simply rent geared to income. Now we look for a blend so that they're a complete community within the community. So our new apartments are typically roughly a third, a third, a third, with rent geared to income, affordable, and modest market. So it would be all of that combined. And really what we're looking for in other communities is land. Obviously we need land that is exceptionally affordable to make the economics work. We are very much in the mode of often we'll refer to it as land banking. When funding comes available, we need to have the land, and we need to have the zoning, and we need to have the designs in place. So we are looking for partnership opportunities to find land in other communities around the county. We know that the need is literally everywhere across the county. There is nowhere that we shouldn't be building more community housing based on the need. The highest wait lists are obviously in Cobourg and Port Hope, where the larger populations are at the moment, but there is still demand. We're talking a wait list of 10 years versus 6 years in the other communities. So there's demand everywhere. And we will certainly be open to partnerships. And we're also looking at partnerships, not just with member municipalities, but for example, our Ontario Street project is a partnership with Ontario Aboriginal Housing and Habitat for Humanity. So we will all be co-owners of the building and all offering various versions of levels of affordability and targeted towards different clientele. So there'll be a broad mix, and we're hoping to do that in more communities across the county.
Thank you. A lot of creativity in government going on there. Director Nitsch, could you please just touch on, we know that there's a lot of uncontrollable costs with our own budgets, from, policing to conservation authorities, et cetera. Can you touch on the uncontrollable costs and mandates from the province that affect the county budget, please?
Well, I don't know that we have enough time.
High level, Matt.
High level. Well, as you're all aware, the majority of what we do is mandatory to begin with, and was probably at one time downloaded from the province. Right. So long-term care home is a good example. So we're mandated by the province to either own or operate a long-term care home within our boundaries. There is some funding provided by the province for that, but it's not enough to cover the costs. So we have to top up with levy funding to make up the difference. We've got paramedics. So the paramedic services are 50% funded by the province. And again, we have to cover the rest of those. We've got our roads that were downloaded. So again, 500 kilometers of roadways that we have to maintain and keep to a certain level, and are deteriorating faster than we can replace them. And then we've got the housing and homelessness, which is something we've talked about already tonight, but also a download to the province, from the province, excuse me.
Thanks. I appreciate those little tidbits just to talk. I mean, we talk about when we do our budget, what we have control over and what we don't. And, it seems less and less of what we actually have overall control over. And that's also true at the county level.
Oh yeah, it's very, very tiny what we have control over.
And maybe next year you'll bring the graph that I'm about to talk about, which is the one that shows where the county budget was going in the late 90s. When there was talk about winding down the county level of government, and the county councils of the day took a very deep dive. And then, of course, that didn't happen. So there's now we continue over the next, course of the next 25 years to rebuild that budget so that we can operate and service the people of the county. So if you just touch on where that went to and maybe bring the graph next year, because it's actually, it's an eye opener.
Yeah, of course. I'll make a note to bring it next time. But we had this phenomenon in the late nineties, early 2000s, where the county budget was slashed. There were negative increases. And so the chart, you can see the steep decline in the levy as a result of that. And then I believe there was some thought at the time that the county was actually going to go away, so that they depleted reserves, et cetera. That never happened. And as a result of that, we had to ramp up, and we've been recovering from that ever since. Funny enough, during the pandemic, we had a 0% increase one year, below inflation increase, and then another small, very small increase. And you can actually see the same phenomenon now happening, where because the services that we have to provide are mandatory, and we have very little control over them. We also unfortunately had the issues with inflation, both consumables, but also non-residential construction type inflation, have all compounded, where we see the same phenomenon again, a slight dip in levy increases to zero. And now we're seeing we need higher increases, and that the increase I talked about is a perfect example of that, in order to be able to recover and keep pace without cutting services.
Because no good deed goes unpunished.
Exactly.
Anything further from members of council? Well, thank you both very much. Appreciate the presentation. I have a motion moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley, that council receive the presentation from CAO Moore and Finance Director Nitsch, Northumberland County overview of the 2024 county budget. Is there any discussion? All in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Madam Clerk, are there any citizens' comments this evening? Thank you. Does anyone need a break? Okay, we'll take a 5-minute recess before we go into staff reports. Thank you. All right, thanks, everyone. It's 8:12 PM. I'll call this meeting back to order. We'll roll into staff reports. Our first report is Council Health Spending Account. Manager Smith, we've read your report. Do you have anything to add or highlight?
No, I do not.
Thank you. I have a motion moved by Councillor Wheeldon, seconded by Councillor Rowley, that council accept the health spending account plan offered through Industrial Alliance outlined below and to approve the revised council annual remuneration policy. Is there any discussion? Councillor Fredis.
So the chair, thank you. So I'm just clarifying that it's not only the health account that we're talking about, it is the compensation policy that was prepared by the consultant a little while back. So the two of them are part of the same package.
It's my understanding. Manager Smith?
That's correct.
Okay. The proposed draft bylaw that's in here talks about a revised per diem for meetings of $75. And this may be just a typo, but it says for 3 hours. My recollection is that the consultant actually said for 4 hours and then 150 for the whole day. So we might want to amend that if my recollection is correct.
On the last slide, slide 10, that is correct. That's it. You are correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess the last comment, and perhaps there'll want to be some discussion about this, is I think it refers in here somewhere to a January 1st start date. That seems a little perhaps unfair and unreasonable in light of the fact that we're at June. Had it been a week or two, perhaps. So might I be able to propose that if we do implement this, it be July 1st? And perhaps that folks would like to have some discussion.
Members of council, how do you feel about when the policy takes effect? Councillor Wheeldon.
Considering we had agreed in principle to this several months ago, and that there were delays due to there being some typos in the previous version, I'm not sure that anything's significantly changed other than that we've had to wait longer. I'd like it to stay in January, if that's all right with everyone.
Councillor Wright, you had your hand up.
I was basically going to highlight the same thing that, yeah.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Councillor Rowley?
Yes, and I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit here. I'm jumping towards the bylaw, just looking at the numbers there. So those numbers that are there, do they include that $2,000 health benefit? Or is that still over and above that?
It's
The annual remuneration?
it's a health benefit offered through Industrial Alliance. I believe staff have sourced a service provider for that purpose.
Right. So my question is, if we were to all use that, does that include it in the annual dollars that we get? So this, I'm going to just read here, the mayor, 39,675. Does that include the 2,000 plus, or so 2,000 plus goes on top of that?
Correct.
Okay.
Councillor Fredis.
Yes, my understanding was the health account is over and above that, but that number also reflects the inflationary adjustment from January. Right. Okay.
Councillor Butwell.
I just more wanted to explain the way that I'm going to vote. I absolutely support the bringing in of a healthcare spending account, but I will be voting against this as a whole simply because of the salary component. So.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Councillor Wheeldon, Councillor Rowley is the mover and seconder. I'm going to write as amended, and the amendment is that $75 for 4 hours, $150 for full day, as per the presentation. Is everyone clear on that? And no movement on the January 1st yet that I'm hearing. So there's want for movement. Before I call the vote, I have that. I'll take a pause, or we can have that discussion at the bylaw when that comes forward. At the next meeting after, whatever that is. Oh, here, tonight. Okay. We can have that discussion when we come to the bylaw if you'd prefer. All those in favor of the motion?
Recorded vote, please.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, Councillor Rowley has requested a recorded vote.
Could you reread the motion just to be sure, please? Thank you.
It's moved by Councillor Wheeldon, seconded by Councillor Rowley, that council accept the health spending account plan offered through Industrial Alliance outlined below and to approve the revised council annual remuneration policy as amended.
Councillor Emily Rowley,
Yes.
Councillor Jeff Wheeldon,
Yes.
Councillor Bobby Wright,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Ron Anderson,
Yes.
Councillor Ann Butwell,
No.
Councillor Byron Foretas,
Yes.
Mayor Brian Ostrander.
Yes.
That's carried.
Next staff report is from Public Works and Infrastructure, Hansen Road Culvert Replacement. Mr. Gooding is not present, so Director Whiteman, we've read Mr. Gooding's report. Do you have anything to add or highlight, sir?
No, I do not.
I have a motion. Thank you. I have a motion moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Councillor Wheeldon, that council award the Hansen Road Culvert Replacement contract to Earthcrete Ontario, Inc. in the amount of $136,326.52, inclusive of 15% contingency and expense portion of the HST. Is there any discussion? Councillor Foretas.
A question to, through the chair to Director Whiteman, if I may. The proposed replacement is with a metal culvert versus concrete. Is there a difference in life expectancy slash cost versus metal versus concrete? Could you enlighten me or comment on that?
Director Whiteman.
For you, Mr. Mayor, it's more cost effective with the corrugated steel than concrete. The life expectancy of the steel is approximately 50 to 75 years. I don't think we are losing that much in terms of life expectancy. As well, there are low volume roads that are there. It's not heavily traveled. So anticipated that there would not be that much of an impact or effect.
Any other questions or comments? Councillor Wright.
So what is the life expectancy of the concrete?
It could be 75, 100 years. It's difficult to say, but maybe there is a bit more.
Any further questions from members of council? Councillor Butwell.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the director. So in going through the different applicants or bidders, I see that there are two at the very low end, and then there seems to be a bunch of them in the middle. Did we select the lowest simply because they were the lowest? Have we done business with Earthcrete at all before?
Yes, they were the lowest. That did have an impact. And we have worked with Earthcrete before. And so they did, I think, fairly good work. There was a little bit of an issue that was more on our side with regard to, I think, the arena, some lateral questions that we did not identify at that point in time. So that was not on them, that was really on us. So they have done good work.
Director, is this the lowest qualified bidder? Is that how we would describe this?
Yes,
particular
that's
bidder?
correct.
Thank you. Anything further from members of council? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Next report is the ongoing report on capital project status. CA authors, we've read through this chart. Have you anything to add or highlight?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. No, I do not.
Thank you. I have a motion moved by Councillor Wheeldon, seconded by Councillor Wright. The council received the ongoing report on capital project status as information. Is there any discussion? Councillor Foretas.
Through the chair to the CAO, How can I put this? Regarding the outstanding physician retention file, can we assume that appropriate remedial measures are being undertaken? And that it'll be reported on in the next earliest closed session possible?
CAO?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Fredis, certainly we should have something on the closed session as soon as June 24th.
And a follow-up, if I may?
You may.
In June of 2023, we received an IT master plan presentation that identified a number of IT initiatives to be undertaken in 2023 and 2024. And I'm wondering if we could add this to the list and receive an updated report on the status of these initiatives. I guess it kind of reinforced to me tonight the importance of that whole IT area and the initiatives, with CAO Moore talking about the Port Hope Police having been victims of or having a cybersecurity issue. And I guess we're exposed to the same thing. So I would hope that we could add this to the report list and get an update on some of those initiatives.
CAO?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Fredis, certainly we can add it, and I will touch base with John in our IT department to determine the possible date that we can put it, but we can add it to the list for sure.
Thank you both. Anything further from members of council? Councillor Wright?
I had two spots on the list. The Public Works half-ton mechanic truck electric drive, that was gas, correct? Yeah, so, because it still says electric drive on the list, so that was. And then for wastewater, it says the design is continuing with consultants, proceeding to 30% design, and design is at 15% completed, but they said today that they were at 30% completed, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Anything further? All in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. There are no notices of motion or motions. There is no unfinished business this evening, which brings us to bylaws. The first is with regard to the remuneration rates for council. It's moved by Councillor Wheeldon, seconded by Councillor Wright. The council gives a bylaw its first, second, and third reading and finally passes on this date, being a bylaw to establish the remuneration rates for the municipality of Brighton members of council. Is there any discussion? Councillor Fredis.
Yes, I would like to raise the discussion again about the implementation date of July 1 and not January 1. I understand my colleague's comment that we've been talking about this for a while, but I wouldn't necessarily agree that we've had consensus on the issue in that first 6 months. And it seems to me inappropriate that we make it retroactive for 6 months. It's only within the last probably month, maybe, that we've kind of reached consensus for the most part. I don't think it's fair to the residents and the taxpayers that we do that. I think July 1 is fair and reasonable. That's my thoughts.
Anyone else? Councillor Botwell?
So you're referring strictly to the healthcare spending piece, or the entire thing?
The entire thing. I mean, my recollection is the healthcare spending was an issue, getting consensus on that. There was an issue relative to mileage, what it was. There was uncertainty in the policy. And at one point it talked about every kilometer within town, which seemed to be unreasonable and unmanageable. I mean, I'm not going to sit there and mark down 2 kilometers to come here and then take out a half a kilometer to go to Sobeys. That's just not practical. At the end of the day, I'm just not going to bother with it. And then there was a whole discussion and dissertation about the size of it. I think we eventually solved that one, but those were just some of the issues that we went back and forth with over a number of months. And I can't say that we had a clear consensus on any of that stuff until very recently. So it seems to me improper and unfair to make something retroactive to January 1st when the consensus has only happened over the last month or so.
Councillor Butwell?
So just a quick follow-up that you're including the salary increase as well, not being retroactive?
It would be the effective date, because we're discussing the bylaw, it would be the effective date of the bylaw. So that would be everything in the bylaw, all the compensatory issues. May I suggest if we're going to make a change that we make it to June 1st? We're 3 days into June. None of us have been paid for June. We could start now instead of retroing for 6 months. I think that would probably be the better way to go. If we're not going to retro at all. Councillor Butwell.
So again, I'm not going to be voting in favor of this. However, it would be fair to make this retroactive to the beginning of the calendar year, much as it would be when negotiating, say, for example, a bargaining unit agreement, or any year-over-year increases that people are in receipt of. It would be consistent and fair for it to be retroactive to the first of this year.
Director Whitfield, if I may, have these increases been factored into our budget?
Mayor Ostrander, thank you for asking that question because that's just what I'm looking at. As you know, I wasn't here through the budget, that part of the budget negotiations, but I do have a line that says we've added 31,163 for CPI into that salary line or that wage line. So that would tell me that they've increased it per the comp review.
So by not retroing it, we save the taxpayer nothing because we've already taxed the taxpayer for the increase.
You are correct.
Thank you. Anything further? Councillor Wheeldon?
I recall that every other compensation increase that came out of the report was also retroactive to January 1st. Is that correct?
I believe at least, right? At least.
No, just to January.
Just to Jan
1st.
1? Okay, thank you. Motion is as is. Any further questions or comments? All those in favor?
Recorded vote, please.
I'm going to read the motion again for fun. It's moved by Councillor Wheeldon, seconded by Councillor Wright. The council gives a bylaw its first, second, and third reading and finally passes on this date, being a bylaw to establish the remuneration rates for the municipality of Brighton members of council. Madam Clerk, Councillor Rowley has requested a recorded vote.
Councillor Emily Rowley,
Yes.
Councillor Jeff Wheeldon,
Yes.
Councillor Bobby Wright,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Ron Anderson,
Yes.
Councillor Ann Butwell,
No.
Councillor Byron Fredis,
Yes.
Mayor Brian Ostrander,
Yes,
and it's carried.
thank you. Next bylaw is with regard to the Hansen Road culvert. It's moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley. That council gives a bylaw its first, second, and third reading and finally passes on this date, being a bylaw to authorize the mayor and the clerk to execute an agreement between the corporation of the municipality of Brighton and Earthcrete Ontario Inc. for capital project PW 2024-03 Hansen Road culvert replacement. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Brings us to reports, minutes of advisory committees of council and review teams. The first is community events and civic awards. It's moved by Councillor Fredis, seconded by Councillor Butwell. The council received the community events and civic awards steering committee meeting minutes of February 13th, 2024, March 12th, 2024, April 9th, 2024, and for information purposes, the draft minutes of May 14th, 2024. Is there any discussion? Councillor Rowley.
One, just a comment, just an announcement for those listening that concerts in the park start this Wednesday. That's it.
Very exciting. We're always happy to have concerts in the park back. Thank you for that. Anything further for members of council? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. And Applefest Advisory, it's moved by Councillor Butwell, seconded by Councillor Fredis, that council received the Applefest Advisory Committee meeting minutes of February 21st, 2024. March 20th, 2024, April 17th, 2024, and for information purposes, the draft minutes of May 14th, 2024. Is there any discussion? All in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Heritage Advisory, it's moved by Councillor Butwell, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council receive the Heritage Advisory Committee meeting minutes of March 11th, 2024. And Councillor Wright, would you like to speak to these minutes?
Just trying to find them in my notes. It's been interesting, the impacts of Bill 23 on heritage. And we were looming under a deadline the end of the year to get houses that were listed either designated or off the list. But I think as of email I saw today, I think there's actually an extension coming to that, which will give us some more breathing room to kind of figure out all the steps that need to happen to make sure we're protecting the heritage homes that we have here, and don't lose them. So.
Thank you for that. Any questions or comments on the minutes? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. And we move on to Accessibility Advisory with a motion moved by Councillor Fredis, seconded by Councillor Butwell, that council receive the Accessibility Advisory Committee meeting minutes of March 8th, 2024. Councillors Wheeldon and Fredis, any comment? Councillor Wheeldon?
Yeah, I just wanted to show some appreciation for us budgeting money for transportation to meetings that has been used. I also was able to connect with our staff here about a county level program that reduces or actually eliminates increases in property tax for eligible people with their disabilities. So there are a few programs that can make life just a little bit easier for people, and we're doing better at those. So very appreciative of that. Thank you to everyone who came out to the Accessibility Awareness Day. I apologize, I had to leave early. I was unwell, but how did it go?
Councillor Fredis?
Through the chair, it went reasonably well, certainly better than having it in the library lobby as we did a year ago. We actually had residents focused in on it. I have to compliment Councillor Wright, who took on the assignment of wheelchairing down from Memorial Park to Lola's to get a coffee and then come back. There were some challenges with the sidewalk. There were challenges getting into Lola's because there's a ramp at the side door, and every time she leaned forward to press the button, the wheelchair would roll back, and I was not permitted to help her unless it tipped over and onto the road. And then coming back out, it was a challenge. What I was very disappointed at, extremely disappointed to the point where I got angry and walked in the middle of the road. A gentleman came down the street and thought he had the right of way, and this lady's in a wheelchair and was going to run her over. And then somebody was turning off Main Street up that road and was going to do the same thing. I was so disgusted. I had to stand out there and give them both the finger to make them stop.
I'm sorry, which finger was that?
This one.
Okay, that finger. That's good. I'm glad to see that.
I was appalled at driving behavior that I saw that day. And if any of our folks that are truly confined to wheelchairs or have mobility issues have to put up with that. That shouldn't be, just shouldn't be. And Bobby, so I thank you very much for taking your life into your hands to try that out on behalf of the committee.
Councillor Wright?
I was oblivious to the finger wagging. I was trying not to spill the coffee that was between my legs and the seat going over the bumps. It was a very enlightening process to determine all the little decisions that you have to make that you don't appreciate when you're an able-bodied person. So it was a very enlightening exercise, and I really appreciate it. Unfortunately, after you left, we did have a lady collapse in Veterans Way. So if you're going to collapse, it's best to do it in front of an accessibility demonstration because you have a whole slew of people to help you. And it was good to note that the ambulance and paramedics showed up in a decent amount of time to assist. So that was a really good thing too.
That's good news. Not the fall, the paramedics showing up on time. Yes. Thank you for that. And while that was happening, I apologize that I didn't make the event I had intention to, but while that was happening, at the county level, we were opening the Universal Porcupine Trail at Northumberland County, which is an accessible trail. So that's why it was opened on that day. Really interesting event that included partners from Alderville who were part of the consultation process because the forest is partially within the First Nation, and but also included the Northumberland Accessibility Group. So lots of folks who were not just in the wheelchair for a day, but in fact were appreciative that there is a trail in the county forest that they can actually run the length of in their accessible devices. So good news there too, but appreciate everybody's help on that one. Any further discussion on the minutes? Those in favor? Being none opposed, that motion's carried. That brings us to reports and minutes of statutory committees, boards, and external agencies. Brighton Public Library is the first, moved by Councillor Fredis, seconded by Councillor Butwell. The council received the April 24th, 2024 Brighton Public Library Board meeting minutes as presented. Councillors Rowley and Wright, any comment?
I'd like to maybe draw your attention to item 5 on page 3 of 4 of the minutes regarding the BDA. The BDA has created a short video. Both Councillor Wright and I saw that at the meeting that day. It's titled The Plate, and it has to do with Wilf and Melba Pound. And it's quite an interesting thing. I don't know exactly when it will be released for everyone to have a look at, but was certainly very interesting 10 minutes to watch.
It probably is. The BDA does have a YouTube channel, so probably it is available on there. So we should all take a chance to see that. It's called The Plate. Thank you. Any further comment on those minutes? Questions from members of council? All those in favor? Being none opposed, that motion's carried. And the next is Lower Trent. It's moved by Councillor Butwell, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that council received the April 11th, 2024 Lower Trent Conservation Authority Board meeting minutes as presented. Councillors Wheeldon and Wright, any comment? Councillor Wheeldon?
Thank you. This is just another opportunity to point out that the Conservation Authority is struggling. We were not able to get enough in the levy to support full-time staff. And so we hired for another temporary position instead of a permanent position, where really a permanent position is needed, but we couldn't afford it. So that's an ongoing struggle that I want to keep awareness on as conservation authorities in general continue to struggle. We also, Kelly Van Det, who's our finance person, has now retired as well. So someone has been hired for that position, which is great. We're going to have good continuity there. And the other major thing is a wetland offsetting policy, something that there is now provincial rules that allow for wetland offsetting, where if you want to take up a little bit of wetland here, as long as you do add more somewhere else, it can be potentially allowable. And we've deliberately drafted a policy that gives staff some authority to be flexible on those things so that they can do a case-by-case basis rather than having hard and fast rules that give them no opportunity to push back where it's warranted or to be flexible where it's needed. So some good things happening there at Lower Trent.
Thank you. Anything else? No. Any further discussion from members of council? All those, go ahead, Councillor Butwell.
Thank you. Through you, just wanted to ask a quick question of Councillor Wheeldon. So am I to understand that you can say, fill in a little wetland here if you make a little wetland over there? Is that?
Councillor Wheeldon?
That's the gist. It really depends. So again, all things at the Conservation Authority are judged on a case by case basis.
Okay.
Like us here, they don't set precedents or make decisions from their desks. So they do a lot of on the ground research to make sure that it can be done, and they prefer not to do it at all. So it's a question of where there's some marginal infringement on wetland, you make a lot of wetland somewhere else.
So would this be like a larger parcel? Because I'm thinking if you need like 100 square feet to hit a setback.
It would be case by
It'd
case.
be case by case. I thought wetlands were like a naturally occurring thing and
They are, but you
nature
can
would-
also make them. We have a nice big wetland that we made here in Brighton too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both. Anything further? Your comment about not setting precedent brings a little tear to my eye, Councillor Wheeldon, I must say. All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Brings us to correspondence, direction items, endorsements, communications, petitions. The first is from the Township of the Archipelago with regard to the testing of private wells. It's moved by Councillor Fredis, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson, that Council support the request from the Township of Archipelago regarding Public Health Ontario proposes phasing out free water testing for private wells. Is there any discussion? Councillor Wheeldon.
We did talk about this at Lower Trent very briefly. There is some indication that this might not end up happening, but it's good to put our voice behind it anyway.
Agreed. Anything further from members of council? Those in favor? Any opposed? The motion's carried. And the next is from Toronto Zoo CEO with regard to World Animal Protection. It's moved by Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Rowley, that council will support the request for the endorsement from Dolph de Jong, CEO, Toronto Zoo, regarding the campaign by World Animal Protection and the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. Is there any discussion? Councillor Wright.
I think I was just shocked. It's just a comment that somebody walking down a street ran into a lion in Ontario. That just kind of blows I could not comprehend that, walking my dogs and bumping into a lion. Well, thank you.
I think it's good that you can't comprehend that. Yeah, this is I think a no-brainer in terms of in terms of animal protection. Interesting tidbit. Mr. Jejong was the assistant superintendent for Presqu'île Provincial Park back in the early part of this century. And he and I worked closely together on the Speedy event back in the day. So it's nice to see that Dolph has gone off to be the head honcho at the Toronto Zoo. So it's nice for everyone. Nice Brighton connection. Anything further from members of council? Those in favor? Being none opposed, that motion's carried. Next is FYI correspondence from Northumberland County, moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Councillor Wheeldon, that council received the updates from Northumberland County, May 27th to June 7th, 2024 as information. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Brings us to question period. Wayne, any questions? Thank you. No one on Zoom for that purpose. That brings us to our closed session. I will read the motion. If council chooses to proceed into the closed session, we will take a 10-minute recess before dealing with the closed session item. The YouTube live stream will end at that point, and we will not return to the YouTube live stream for the duration of the meeting. I have a motion moved by Councillor Rowley, seconded by Councillor Wheeldon. The council resolve itself into closed session June 3rd, 2024 at 8:46 p.m. Pursuant to the Ontario Municipal Act, RSO 2001 as amended, subsections 239(2)(c), a proposed or pending acquisition or disposition of land by the municipality or local board, land in the industrial park, proposed sale and proposed land banking purchase, and D, labor relations or employee negotiations, the CUPE agreement. Is there any discussion? All in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. We will take a recess and reconvene at 8:57 PM.